Good morning, everyone. I hope everyone is excited for the conversation that we're about to have now around best performing schooling systems. It promises to be something that is quite worth looking forward to. So I'd invite all of you to share a link with your family and your friends to have them join into the conversation right now. My name is Sihle Ngesi-Magubane, and I'm the Chief of Staff at Jakes Gerwel Fellowship. Welcome to all of you, and I look forward to having quite a fruitful engagement with all of you on this call right now. So, my first job is to introduce the session, which is around best performing schooling systems in the world, and we're going to hear from a panel of globally renowned experts in this area. And it is my absolute pleasure to introduce first and foremost to you Chinezi Chijioke, who is not only the founder and CEO at Nova Pioneer, but we also have the privilege of claiming him as one of our board members at the Jakes Gerwel Fellowship. So Chinezi holds a couple of accolades actually, and just to give you a bit of a high-level view, he was previously the head of McKinsey's African education practice. He holds an MBA and Master's in Education from Stanford University, and also a BA with honors from Harvard University. He also started his career as a teacher and then later on became an education entrepreneur. So it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Chinezi to speak to us today. Chinezi, over to you.
Thank you, Sihle, and thanks everyone. It's really great to be able to connect today, and really excited about the colleagues and friends who we have joining us to talk and think together about how to achieve whole school system improvements. Right, the Jakes Gerwel Fellowship as an organization, and the fellows who are the heart and soul of this organization are collectively committed to positive transformative impact in education. And that means whole system improvements, starting in the classroom, but extending across many classrooms and many schools across whole systems. And so I think sort of kicking off the summit with a session that focuses on whole school system improvement anchors it in that context, which is great that we're thinking together about this. About 11 years ago, it's about a decade now, and it's hard to believe. It ages all of us, especially you and I, Li-Kai. About a decade ago, while I was working with McKinsey, we conducted some research and published a report on what we learned around whole school system improvement from around the world, right? And it was an effort to go from just thinking about improvement at the level of an individual classroom or level of an individual school to say, how do you improve across whole systems? And how do you improve not just a study of the best systems? Actually, in some ways, this session is misnamed. It wasn't about the best systems. It was about improving from wherever you are, right? And we published that, and we said, here's what we learned. And now that was a decade ago, right? And in that decade, a lot has happened. A lot of good work, a lot of good effort, a lot of success, some successes, many failures have happened in the era of in the domain of school system improvements. And so this conversation is a conversation that tries to look back, anchors itself in some of that work, but then seeks the perspective of two people in particular who are more actively currently engaged in the work of school system improvement, to say, what are your reflections and critiques on that? What are our learnings now? And what is exciting, or what are the opportunities now in school system improvement that all of us, in particular fellows, as early career educational activists, essentially, have an opportunity to think about and shape. So that's what this conversation is about. The way we're going to do it is we're going to first I'll introduce two friend colleagues and leaders in the space, and after that I'll frame up the conversation with a little bit of like a 5-minute to 10-minute synopsis of what did that report, what were some of the insights of that report 10 years ago? What did we learn 10 years ago? Or what do we think we learned 10 years ago? Then I'll interview Li-Kai and Asyia to get their thoughts and reflections on it. We'll have a discussion about it. And finally, we will do any questions and answers openly for anyone who's participating in this. Sihle will curate those. And so throughout the session, if questions or comments come up, throw them into the chat. So I know Sihle is tracking them, and he'll help us lead the back half of the conversation. Okay. Great. With that, really excited and really grateful to have both Asyia Kazmi and Li-Kai Chen joining us. I'll briefly give us intro, then Asyia and Li-Kai, I'll ask you if you're up for it to sort of give 2 to 3 minutes on the work you are doing in the area of school system improvements, or that you have done or are doing. So folks, I think it's helpful for this community to have a sense of the kind of work you do and what the possibilities are there. I think it puts in good context. So firstly, Asyia, thank you so much. Asyia is joining us while on leave, guys. So really appreciate it, Asyia, to do that. And as hard as you work, Asyia, I know it's really, it's a lot to be asking you to just to take time off on leave. So grateful to you for doing so. Asyia and I share the distinction of having started our careers as mathematics teachers. Now she is the global lead, the global education policy lead for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and leads a wide breadth of work across global education improvement work, and has had multiple chapters in that story, from classroom through to system leadership, which she is involved in now. And in a second, we'll ask Asyia to say a little bit more. And then Li-Kai also hugely grateful. He is I believe it's Singapore right now, thumbs up, or Hong Kong. I think Singapore at the moment, if I'm not mistaken. So joining us late into his evening. So thank you, Li-Kai, for doing that. Li-Kai is a partner at McKinsey & Company and is a leader of the global education practice at McKinsey & Company. And over the years, we've had opportunities to collaborate, and in the past decade has done a fair amount of work in supporting school systems, among other forms of public system work, and brings a great perspective to this topic as well. So if I could ask you, just if you don't mind, I've given like truly the executive summary of an extended career in ed reform, and I wonder if you just share a little bit of the work you've done and do in global education improvement, and then we'll ask Li-Kai to do the same.
Thank you very much, Chinezi. And I think your invitation was to talk about a focus on teaching, and I thought I can't say no to that. So I love teaching. It's a great profession, and I've done it from very many different angles. But the most proudest I've been has been as a teacher. So currently in the global education team in the Gates Foundation, we're a very small team of 4 people, and we have an unrelenting focus on what we call the 9 out of 10 statistics. So if you're born in a high income country, by the age of 10, 9 out of 10 children will be able to read. In a low-income country, 9 out of 10 children will not be able to read. So our focus is trying to understand that problem, trying to consider what it is that we might be able to do about it, and then to take some action. So we have very much a public goods focus on improving foundational literacy and numeracy in government schools, particularly in the early grades of government schools. And we focus on research that's related to that, innovation that's related to that, innovation in pedagogy as well as in edtech, and then thirdly, some country programming. So we have a more established program in India, and in Sub-Saharan Africa, we're just starting this year. So not a specific focus on South Africa, but certainly on Sub-Saharan Africa.
Super. Thanks. Asyia, that's really helpful context, and I'm excited to get your reflections on the themes and opportunities in school system improvement, particularly in the 9 out of 10, the parts of the world where 9 out of 10 kids don't have the opportunity at this point to really get high quality learning and growth. Li-Kai, do you mind sharing a little bit about the work you have done and do in education in particular?
Sure. Thank you, Chinezi. So, hi everyone. My name is Li-Kai. As Chinezi has mentioned, I'm currently with McKinsey. My recent role was leading our global education practice. So the global education practice at McKinsey, we work with school systems across the world. This is in Asia, in Africa, in Europe, Latin and North America on school system improvement. So as Chinezi pointed out, we're also very passionate about teaching and learning, and more importantly about systems improvement. So starting from the earliest research we conducted in the world's best performing school systems. Then, as Chinezi pointed out, we then started looking at the world's most improved school systems. And then in the last several years, we started looking at what are the drivers of improvement, what are the key drivers of learning outcomes for students.
Fantastic. I'm excited to hear more about that. We haven't had enough chance in the past 10 years, Li-Kai, to really get your retrospectives on the work we did together earlier and to hear more about the work you're doing now. So I think it'll be really great to get that in this conversation. So what I want to do is then kick off the substance of the conversation and frame it, first of all, by anchoring it in the work, the research we did 10 years ago. And I'll do sort of a 5 to 10 minute presentation on that just to create the substantive context, and then we'll turn it back into an interview here. So I'm just going to share screen to do that. Very briefly, a grand total of 2 slides. First, what was that report? On the first slide here. The report, again, was called How the World's Most Improved School Systems Keep Getting Better. And what it did is it identified 20 school systems globally around the world, again, not individual schools, but school systems that had achieved what was significant, so large, sustained over a period of 6 to more years, and widespread across, widely across the system for different parts and segments of the system, increases in student learning. So not just the metrics of access, for example, or metrics of resourcing, but actually measured outcomes in students' learning, whether it's in math, literacy, and or science. And it's in doing so, it's had a pretty wide and diverse sample of school systems. So these were really large ones, looked at sort of school systems as large as South Korea, for example, or smaller ones, districts, or Singapore, as an example, it's a nation, but a much smaller nation. So some large to small, huge diversity in across all 5 continents. In South Africa, interestingly, the Western Cape at that point had demonstrated significant sustained gains. It was one of the what we call promising starts in school system improvement at the time. Wide range of performance levels. So while the Western Cape was improving on a global scale, it wasn't a great performing school system. It was a comparatively, relatively poor performing school system. And we had a full range of performance, but all of these school systems were demonstrating improvement at a significant, sustained, and widespread basis. And so that was what was really exciting, because the counterfactual were a set of school systems that hadn't. School systems that hadn't actually, despite increasing resources and tons of efforts, had stagnated or actually decreased. And so we wanted to understand how this happened. So the research really focused on a few things. It said, what are the journeys of improvement? What are the interventions, the substance of what these systems did? And what patterns or learnings can we draw from that for those who want to lead further school improvements? What enabled these things to be sustained, these changes to be sustained? And what got them ignited? How did they get started? Can we learn anything from those things? Because a lot of system leaders or system change agents want to figure out how to get this going and how to sustain it. And so, with that, that was sort of the process. There was an intervention database, huge analytical exercise, tons of one of the real privileges was getting to meet with system leaders, whether they're teachers or principals or parents or policymakers, and each of these 20 school systems around the world, and to be able to try to synthesize learning from it. And the report then published a number of lessons. I think there were sort of 10 lessons, but I just want to highlight 6 of them. One, for the purpose of creating some, not overwhelming this conversation, not overwhelming substance of the conversation, but also because these, in my reflection, had garnered sort of the most energy, whether that was resonance or whether that was debate. And I think they're probably therefore the most useful for sort of anchoring our conversation. The first was a really optimistic message that whole school system improvement is achievable and in a relatively short period of time. You can see significant, meaningful gains that represent an additional year of school, for example, for a child, of that much learning in a period of as short as 6 years. So this was not something that had to be a 20-year journey. You could actually shift trajectory now. That was the first point. The second one, I think this probably garnered the most resonance or discussion, or felt like perhaps the biggest contribution, at least at that time. I don't know if it resonates. Li-Kai and Asyia can give perspectives on this. But it was that the journey of improvement differed depending on where you're starting. So if you're a poor performing school system with generally weak capacity or capabilities, the set of interventions that would improve you to be solid or good and move sort of to fair and good were different from the journey from good to great. And that you had to therefore tailor the substance, the interventions to those journeys. But within each of those journeys, all the systems we studied that were going from poor to fair or from good to great, there were real consistencies across context, whether I was in Ghana or whether I was in Peru, right? Or whether I was in Singapore at the time when it was going from poor to fair, there was real consistency in those themes. So we mapped out these different journeys, and that was exciting because it was a substance of intervention, the what we could do. One of those, which I think is where I found the most debate often in these conversations, and even now as a leader of an independent schools, a smaller, much smaller independent school system, is the theme of going from good to great being that you have to prescribe adequacy, but can unleash greatness. So that when you have low capacity and low outcomes in the system, variability is often failing children. You often fail your children through variability. And so you actually have to create less flexibility, or can create, whether it's much more guidance to create a consistency in the floor. And then as you build capacity, that actually develops the professional capacity. And then as you do that, you have to unleash greatness. You cannot script greatness. You can only unleash it through this processes between educators. And so this was the reason this was challenging was because you had a number of educators who went, well, this is sort of constricting my professional practice, but actually builds professional practice, particularly in low-performing school systems. The fourth one was, how did this happen? It was interesting. It always took a trigger. This was never sort of just business as usual. There was always a crisis or report that was damning or a new political leader. It took major shock to the system to get these things going. And so that's quite challenging for an existing school system that may be feeling in stasis. Fifth one, that ignition notwithstanding, you then had to have leadership continuity. In this country, in South Africa, you have had ministerial continuity at a national level. There have been some shifts at a provincial level, but you needed leadership continuity in whatever system it was, because generally many systems get changes over every 2 to 3 years in the key leaders, and you couldn't do that. All 20 out of 20 systems, I believe it was, had a leadership continuity at either technical or ministerial level for a period of 6 years or more. And then the last one, and this is one that has also generated a lot of interest, because it wasn't a theme that we had seen or was certainly part of my conversation on school system improvements before this, but really resonated with practitioners inside school systems, which was the importance of a middle layer, whether that is districts in a South African context, or different countries have different nomenclatures for it. But that middle layer, and I'm having a conversation recently with some work in Kenya around Tusome, which has been a school system improvement effort, much more recent. The important role that districts play, for example, in South Africa with data-driven districts, the number of interventions focusing on, if you want this to be sustainable, then you actually need to use that middle layer to sustain and support improvement. So these were some of the lessons at that point of school system improvement that we sort of anchored and shared and tried to sort of contribute based on our learning. So with that, what I'm going to ask as we sort of turn this, as we sort of close the slides now, I'm going to turn this, sort of bring in Asyia and Li-Kai now. And Asyia, Li-Kai, I'm really keen on two things, and we take them in sort of an order. First is like, what made sense there? If you sort of, looking back now, looking at some of those observations, what resonates as true and helpful for those of us who are trying to work on school system improvements? That'll be sort of point one. And then point two, let's critique it. What would you change about it, or what would you build to it? What did we get wrong, perhaps, or what was incomplete that in retrospect we may have learned that would fill out the picture and improve our understanding of it? So we'd love to just get your thoughts, and then we'll maybe dig into one or two of those themes. I wonder if Asyia, I can ask you to kick off, and then Li-Kai, keen on your thoughts.
Sure. Thank you. I promise you, I'm not just saying this because you're the one who's asking me the question. It is my kind of report, and I liked it because it was hopeful. It crossed sort of geographies, and it crossed and it talked about improvement. So every system, education system, is continuously improving. So where you are, as the report suggested, you might be doing different things to do so. I think three things that really stood out for me was the strong focus. Just before I answer that, too, where I was at the time, I've been one of Her Majesty's inspectors in Ofsted, and I was just finishing off in the UK education system, and I was part of the national strategies, which is one of the reform efforts that the report describes. And I was going into international development in the Department for International Development in the UK. So three things that resonate with me is the focus on leadership, and systems, and the importance of having a high expectations culture, the importance of having a moral purpose and wanting to do something about it. And then coupling that, because the passion is not enough, coupling that with real strong program management systems that might be more universal, but then personalizing it for education. So I think that that's one of the aspects of what that leader and the role of that leader is, and the leadership at different levels. So that district level, middle level leadership is really important, because in education, you're trying to get millions and millions of people to do something different every single day. My own personal kind of passion is for teaching. So this aspect of strong focus on improving teaching. And that sentence, and that's always resonated with me, is the system cannot exceed the quality of teachers. I would probably amend it to the quality of teaching and depersonalize by the person doing. And so this aspect of how teachings and then nuggets there, you know, on coaching, on teaching, on what these strong systems are doing, that really resonating. But I think the most important aspect was the focus on learning. There's, you know, as we said in Ofsted, is don't tell me what the adults are doing, tell me the so what of what's happening on children. And if we can focus more of our attention on global education as well, is what is the difference that the adults are doing is making to the learning. And that question, if we flip it on its head, it takes away from the access issue, because yes, access is obviously important, but what are you accessing? And by accessing schooling, what are you actually learning? What are the hard skills that you move away from? So having been in different roles in global education, I remember somebody once said to me, education is not just about literacy and numeracy. And I completely agree, it's much wider than that, but it should at least be about literacy and numeracy, and it should be about learning. So those are some things that resonated with me. And the final point is, I read it in 2010, and I just briefly glanced at it today in preparation for this, and so much of it is still applicable. And kind of like, you know, we should be able to move on in the education. And we don't see advancing the dialogue, particularly in low middle income countries, as much as we are in high income countries.
Super. Thanks. A couple of seeds there. We get back to the what could be built, or how do we build on or improve on the reports. One of the things, two things that have made me seed for thought, Asyia, as to think about it. When my reflection on the high expectation culture in particular is one that really resonates, and in retrospect, one of the areas out of I think could have been productive is if in that work we had spent more time actually looking at how do system leaders shift culture to high expectations. And ultimately it's a behavioral shift that leads a mindset shift, but the how, and it's sort of the role of the system leader, but it's if you're a system leader or anybody, when I'm leading a classroom or a school, or how to shift that culture is imperative for shifting trajectory. And I'd be keen to sort of, that was one of my reflections on the area. I think there was opportunity to do more, but we'd be keen when we sort of take the second half of this coin to get your reflections on that, on other areas we could build on the report. Li-Kai, maybe your take. What was useful? Yeah, maybe your first take, and we'll stick with you to go to the improvements before we come back to Asyia.
Thanks, Chinezi. So since the report was published in 2010, over the last 10 years, I've had the opportunity to work with system leaders in close to about 30 school systems. The two out of the 10 findings, which Chinezi outlined earlier, the two that we found were most powerful was, for at least for education systems, was I think number 2, the one around the fact that improvement is possible, but more importantly, every school system is on an improvement journey from poor, fair, good, great to excellent. And what was unique about the school system improvement journey is there is a science to it, that any school system, doesn't matter whether it's in Africa, in Asia, in the Middle East, and so on, school systems that move from poor to fair adopt a very similar set of interventions. And school systems who move from good to great adopt a very similar set of interventions. And that was powerful because what we also found out was over the last 10 years is of the 70% of school system reforms globally that fail, a lot of them fail because either they were adopting school system reforms which were not relevant to their improvement journey. So we found that there was no such thing as best practice. What was more important was relevant practice. So school system reforms failed because they adopted intervention initiatives which were not relevant to their performance, to their improvement journey. And the other big reason for failure was school systems improved, but then they stuck to what worked in the past. So school system moved from poor to fair to good, couldn't quite lift to great or excellent because they stuck to what worked for them to get them to good. Right? So that was quite a powerful. The second powerful one out of the 10 was this concept around there are 3 different types of interventions that Chinese pointed out. When school system reforms happen, they either focus on process reforms, professional development, changing how existing things are done, leadership development, or they focus on resource reforms, funding, teacher allocation, headcount, or they focus on structure interventions, organization, shifting structure and so on. And 70% of the interventions of successfully improving school systems were process interventions. That was actually quite an important insight because as school systems think about reform, invariably they get caught up in structure and resource because that's immediate, that's obvious. But what often they don't realize is those reforms are the toughest. It takes time. It's very political. And so systems that focus on process reforms get things done. And then, so those are the 2, but I think I also really like Chinese's push around with the benefit of 10 years of hindsight. What could the report have looked at further? So in my mind, there are also 2 topics, which I think over the last 10 years, we've had the opportunity to explore further since the report. One was the realization, and again, no surprise to folks in the Zoom today, that even though we think about school systems as being in improvement journeys, are you in a poor to fair journey, fair to good, good to great? The reality is no school system is homogeneous. No school system has every single school in a poor to fair journey or good to great journey. So if we take a school system, let's say in Australia, one of the top 10 systems in the world, there are certain states in Australia where the school system improvement journey is more of a poor to fair journey. Some it's a good to great journey. And even within a state, there are schools which are excellent schools, some schools which are poor schools. So the challenge then is no longer around identifying where you are in the performance journey and what interventions you should adopt, but how do you take a differentiated approach to school system improvement? How do you take a network of schools, a district, a school system, or national system, or state system, identify which pockets, which schools are in which performance journey, contextualizing it, and making sure that they get the right support, the right accountability to adopt the right interventions for their context. That was the challenge. Right? The other, and we can go deeper, but I think the other insight, powerful push, as Chinese said, what were some of the gaps we found was the 2010 report identified the what. What do school systems have to do to improve? What was actually quite relevant and powerful was how do school system leaders do it? So for example, one key aspect, how do school system leaders win the hearts and minds of the front line, right? The educators, the teachers, the school leaders, the parents, the policymakers, the school system officers. How do you win hearts and minds across the stakeholders so that you can actually not just ignite, but in Chinese's words, ignite and sustain reform? So how do you co-create reform journeys with the stakeholders so it's not seen as a top-down effort, for example?
Li-Kai, I'm so glad. Thank you for that. I'm so glad you, particularly that first one, well, both of those builds, because literally I remember, first time we took the presentation on the road to share with stakeholders or to share with or to consult with system leaders, it immediately became apparent like no system. The point of homogeneity, no system is just good to great, or no system is just poor to fair. If we think about the system we live in South Africa, we have a very differentiated school system. Subsets of the school system that are really excellent, but a majority of the school system that actually is in the poor to fair journey, right? And a question I wonder is, how have you advised, or how have you, when you've worked with school systems in tackling that diversity? So I have multiple journeys. I have some schools that have great capability and some that don't. I have issues of inequity, right? And I have to think about how to approach a very diverse school system. How have the school systems you've worked with since then approached that diversity?
Got it. So, Chinese, I noticed this is Zoom, so we can use a whiteboard. Do you mind if I whiteboard something? It's a great question.
Go for it.
So, Let me try this. Okay, can everybody see my screen?
It says Li-Kai, yeah, Li-Kai is sharing screen. Yep, we got it.
Got it. So why don't we try this? So Chinezi asked a very good question, which is how do you adopt almost a differentiated approach, right? So if you think about a matrix, right? So here, can everybody see what I'm drawing?
Yes, we can.
Okay. If you think about a matrix, so on one axis, a matrix is the performance of a school system. So this is great performance. This is good performance, and this is not so good performance. And on the other axis, you plot the trajectory. Is a school system, is a school declining? Are they stagnating or are they improving? Right? So here, you then start plotting every single school in the school system, for example, or school district. So what you then find is that as every dot represents a school, you then form a picture of the school system. For example, there are some school systems in this category in the upper right where these are very high performing schools who are improving. Very different from schools in this category on the lower left, which are school systems which are underperforming, failing schools, but also declining. Then you've got a large middle section, which is school systems who are good schools, the schools of choice, but they've been stagnating for years. So once you form a better picture of the school system, you can then say, to Chinese's point, you can identify where these schools are in terms of both trajectory and performance. So for example, on the vertical axis, is a school system poor, fair, good, great, or excellent? On the horizontal axis, this is, are they declining or stagnating? You form a picture of your school system, and then you can say, look, for schools in these different segments, how do I intervene? And this provides a better picture for school systems to adopt different interventions, both in terms of support and accountability. So for school systems in the top right, these are school systems which are fantastic. They're schools, not schools. These are, let's say, the 5% of schools in a school system which are thriving. They're high-performing schools, they're innovating. For these school systems, this is about innovation, letting them innovate, giving them more autonomy, earned autonomy, and allowing them to thrive. And the role of the system is then identifying what best practices do they have and then replicating it. For schools in this category, underperforming schools who are failing, these are the red alert schools. This is where they need more support, much more support, not less. They need greater accountability in terms of monitoring. This is where school leaders need more help. They're struggling. This is where you allow the school to focus on a few priorities, not many, so that they can prioritize and focus. So this helps form a picture in terms of how do you support, how do you provide accountability, intervene. So this goes back to the point, again, Chinezi made earlier, which is around, it's not just about school improvement journeys. It's not just about identifying where you are, but being quite granular use of data to identify where is a school, what is the unique context of the school, and which schools can this particular school learn from.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Li-Kai. It's interesting, and for sort of our participants who want to contextualize in South Africa, I remember a conversation, the kind of issues this raised. I remember a conversation with one of our provincial leaders or leadership teams who were looking at this issue, and they sort of had a sense of this segmentation of their schools. They didn't use the horizontal axis, but certainly on the performance axis. And the questions, it's really interesting because this says, what's the relevant intervention or support for each individual school? But the kind of questions they had to tackle, and this is if you are leading a system like one of our provinces, you would ask is, I have limited resources. Where do I put my efforts? Do I put my efforts to the top performing schools who can achieve great? Do I put my efforts to the bottom performing schools where the political mandate and imperative may be strongest, and maybe the ethical mandates, but it'll take the amount of resource it takes, I may move a little bit. Or do I put my resource into the middle where I can get large gains for more kids, but then I'm leaving behind let's say the bottom quintile or the bottom 2 quintiles of our schools? And these are real ethical and policy questions. The other one is, how do I create interdependence? We've had school linking efforts where you take a high performing school and link it with a low performing school, but does that really work? And you may end up, I'm not yet real clear on the evidence that school systems that are on different journeys actually are really good supports to each other. And we sort of assume that the resource base can transfer, but no, you've got parents in this high performing school who are saying, well, I still want to be better. And you've got low performing school systems who are saying, well, my resource context isn't what yours is. So how can you really understand what I need to be doing? And so it's interesting to think about the choices you face within that segmentation and the a really tough choice, and sort of the strategies maybe that you can employ that are not just individual school shifts, but sort of think of them being in the same system together. But I wonder, Asyia, just to pull you, keen to get your reflections on this, and then would also love to what other builds or things you would change about the research from 10 years ago. But we've keen to get your thoughts on this particular conversation first.
Yeah, I was smiling when Li-Kai presented that that quadrant, because my first point was the same, that every school has every system has schools at different levels. I think it's a difference of the degree, how many of the poorer schools you have, or in Ofsted language special measure schools you have versus how many good schools you have. And every school system is continually shifting. So I completely agree with that. I think that matrix can be applied in terms of globally, where our education systems in countries, within countries to districts. So which are the districts that are facing the most challenges? How do we support them? The schools, and then in schools, secondary schools, subject areas, there will be variations within that, and students as well. So in that category that the UK had was special measures requires improvement. Before satisfactory was called, before grade 3 was called satisfactory, and they shifted that to requires improvement, that satisfactory is not good enough. And that's where the coasting schools came in. So they might not get on the radar because the results were at a certain level, but they're coasting, they're not improving. And then you have good and outstanding. So I think this is a really important point about the journeys that schools make. Then the other aspect is the link between poverty and school effectiveness. I think this is where it would have been great to see more of similar circumstances. And it goes to this point about how do you learn from others? And we know one of the signs of organizational effectiveness is always striving to do better. Who else is doing what? Beg, borrow, and steal from others that are doing that. So if you are in similar circumstances and you buck the trend, so you're the bottom 2 quintiles for poverty, but you're one of those schools that is at the top end in my specific terminology, smashing it, right? So schools and those leaders who are smashing it to support those who want to improve. And that I think is an interesting relationship to foster when you're learning from each other, similar context, but very different outcomes. I think also reflecting on the 4 levels that you had from fair to grade. For example, you had coaching in the 3rd layer and peer learning in the 4th layer. I think it'd be interesting to see when you're mixing it up and doing coaching like Tusome has done in Kenya, and middle leadership development that India is doing right now. So having some of those some of those interventions that are not necessarily at the high end, but actually on the poor to improving journey, what does that look like there? I think my final point would be more detail on how we're improving the quality of teaching. And it goes back to this point about not just the what they did, but how they did this, and how do you motivate teachers? Because essentially, when you close your classroom door, if you have a door, you are king of the classroom. What you do, you can do anything. You can choose to follow the script or not follow the script. So how do you inspire and motivate, enthuse teachers to do what's right for their students when nobody is watching? And what are the characteristics of effective leaders that enable that motivation to take place? A couple of, when we dug deeper into the Tusome example in Kenya, you had middle leaders saying, I was just promoted to this level, I wasn't given any training. But this training that I've now had, this clarification of what my role is, has made me walk taller and stand taller. And I remember that district official using that phrase. So how do you bring this sense of pride and into teaching again? I think in some contexts we've lost it. It's the least desired profession, but actually it is the most important in my view. So how do we bring that sense of pride, that sense of responsibility, as opposed to we're doing this because somebody's watching?
Absolutely. Really grateful. Sorry, go for it, Li-Kai. Go for it.
If I may build on what Asyia said, there's this core principle around the quality of a system. Can I see quality is teaching? And ultimately, at the end of the day, it is always about achieving learning. Is this whole concept about for school system, education system reform. At the end of the day, nothing matters unless, exactly to Asya's point, nothing matters unless changes are happening in teaching and learning in the classrooms. Doesn't matter what the policymakers, what the decision makers are doing at the center. And therefore, this concept of understanding, having a good picture that Asyia outlined in terms of how each and every school is doing. Where are they? Not just in terms of performance, but also in terms of trajectory. Are they declining? Are they stagnating, coasting, are they improving? Because the other insight we over the last 10 years is in every school system we work with, we looked at, solutions are almost always already in the system. Doesn't matter whether the system is high performing, poor performing. There are always pockets of excellence. There are always schools, they're always educated within the system who've done it right against the odds. They may be hard to find, they may be the unlikeliest of places, but it's always there. So what this understanding of the system, if I think about the matrix I badly drew earlier, is what it also allows you to do, allows system leaders to do is, which schools can we learn from in which segment? So there are certain schools which have been underperformed, they've been against the odds, similar context, they've improved. So those are the schools these other schools can learn from. So that allows a very practical learning to happen between schools, so teaching and learning improvement can happen. And again, I think that the point we found out, and again, I suspect no surprise everyone in the Zoom room here is, often it is great to look at relevant practice from other countries, but often once you look at a system closely, the relevant practices are already in our system. We just need to find which schools, which districts are doing what is right, contextualizing it, codifying it, and making sure that we're learning from those lessons in our system.
Thank you. And go for it. Go ahead, Asyia.
The prerequisite is having good quality data that allows us to do that identification. And the identification of who's bucking the trend, but also who needs support. And certainly in LMIC, the quality of data is poor. So then we need to find other proxies for that data, so to have more targeted differentiation, but also to have that matchmaking and identification to be able to qualify.
This is great because it's shifting us to a bit of the how, right, from the what's. The how, like how do you find, if you do have the data and can identify successful strategies and champions within your system, that's probably gonna have a lot more traction than sort of external recommendations for what to do, for example. In a second, Sihle, I'm gonna ask if there are any questions. So just maybe give me like the thumbs up, or if we have some questions, in which case awesome. So we'll get them in a second. Li-Kai and Asyia, we'll go to questions now. At the end, what I'd love to do at the end of this conversation is just ask you to close out with a minute or two on what you're excited about in the area of school system improvements, sort of leave with as much optimism as we started, because I think that sort of, and it creates opportunities for the fellows who are part of this session. I did want to pick up Asyia, your point on coaching. I was really grateful you raised it, because I think that was something we've seen, whether it's Tusome, for folks who are participating in the session don't know Tusome, it's an improvement effort in Kenya that is showing some real results. The Gauteng improvement strategy here in Gauteng, for those of us who are in Gauteng or here in South Africa, these are places where in really low performing schools and systems, coaching has made a substantial difference, in part because of what Asyia you said. It supports the development of professional practice, right? And the challenge there is less that the intervention is not suited, but that the cost effectiveness of it's very expensive usually. And so things like the innovation, things like Tusome have been how to do it at a low and affordable cost. And there's some really that's one area I'm excited about is this problem solving to bring some of these supports to a cost effective level, whether it's through tech or through system training, that really makes it that makes the things like that build professional practice, that touch teaching, much more scalable and sustainable within low income countries in particular. Sihle, maybe help throw some questions our way, and then we'll close out at the end after those with Asyia and Li-Kai's points of optimism.
For sure. Thank you so much, Chinezi, Asyia, and Li-Kai. This is, there isn't enough time in the day to have a conversation like this. I'm quite excited with all the insights and the questions that are coming through here. So the first question is from Wandile. And Wandile is asking, I have a simple question. What were the metrics that were used to measure the success of improvement over the years?
I'll take that one. And then I wonder if, in addition to Li-Kai and Asyia, if that's an area you would think we should look at it differently. What was used there very simply was each of these systems participated in some standardized assessments, whether it's PISA or SACMEC or TIMSS. In the case of Western Cape, there were more sort of, I forget what the name was, but there were standardized over period assessments, standard assessments that were then used, that we were able to then benchmark and we were able to link statistically. So we had what was called a universal scale of improvement. But basically it measured improvement in mathematics, literacy, and or science by students, and shifts in achievement levels by students year on year. And so it was those standardized assessments that were used. Anything, Asyia or Li-Kai, you would add to what should be used?
I think it's a really good question. And it goes to, the measures tend to fall on students, and especially in international development where you want an evaluation, it becomes, what is the purpose of this assessment? Who is it for and who does it serve? I'm more interested in again, going back to my own teaching experience, where I'd gone to the school that I studied at, which was very low outcomes. And then in 3 years, we got it to the national average. And the micro competencies, what are the green shoots we should be looking for that signal improvement is being made? So if we took to reading, it'll take time to get to reading with comprehension. But if we didn't have any markers along the way, we cannot afford to go 4 years down the line and say, whoops, we didn't make much difference. So we need to break that down, and breaking it down into, okay, how realistic is it to have children being able to do letter sound recognition? How realistic is it for them to be able to know what their numbers represent up to a number of them 10? And if we broke it down to time-specific targets, if it takes, if the evidence says it takes 3 months, okay, we'll give teachers 6 months, 12 months. Let's track that. And then really looking for, and this will be localized, it'll be context specific, but we need a framework that says, this is how it generally breaks down. And in this area, this is how it breaks down. Clearly, if you're coming from, families that have high income, you've been exposed to a lot of language, you're going to be hitting the ground running. If you've not had that, it becomes the responsibility of the school to bridge that gap. So we need to be more careful in thinking about what those micro competencies are. The global minimum proficiency framework that UIS has done is a good step towards that. We have local regional assessments that are citizens-based assessments that are also a good indicator for that. But each school has a curriculum. How do they measure progress on that curriculum? And what does that look like at a district level? So I think it's really important that we are looking for green shoots of progress in learning.
Yeah. I fully agree with Asyia. I think it was really, really well articulated. I only have one thing to add, which is, as for system leaders, as you think about measuring performance, there is no right answer. There are different ways of looking at it, different metrics and so on. But I think from the last several years, if we think about one lesson come out, it will be, don't let the perfect get in the way. Don't let perfection get in the way of the good. You rather have a adequate measure that allows you to get started in terms of understanding school segments, differentiated interventions, as opposed to trying to design the perfect measure of performance that satisfies the entire system. And that is a few years down the line. By then you may realize you haven't made progress.
Of that point. Sihle, any other questions that would be useful for us to tackle?
For sure, definitely. So I have a couple more questions, but I'll keep it to 2. And I'll pose this specific question to you, Chinezi, from Christian Muller, who asks, many educators are calling for a unique education system for our country. There is a drive to move away from the established European models of education. Is it smart for South Africa to move away from what works in the first world rather than adopt something Afrocentric? What would you recommend for South Africa?
Thank you for that. Sihle, do you mind also just sort of articulating the second question too, so Li-Kai and Asyia have a chance to hear it and process it while I maybe respond to this one?
For sure, definitely. So Asyia and Li-Kai, the second question is from Stembiso Mbata, asking, is there a way of adding the arts into the universal standards? Shouldn't they be just as important?
Super. And I see a comment which I totally appreciate the resonance of, don't let perfection get in the way of good, because we've got a lot of way to get to perfect, so we can make a lot of improvement on the way there. To the point of Afrocentric, more Afrocentric model, I guess my view is it depends on what that is. You know, at the end of the day, what matters for me is creating success and thriving for students across the world and in Africa for African young people. And I think we need a system that produces two things, that gives every child the opportunity to participate, to access the world essentially, and that means basic ability to read, write, calculate, express ideas, build self-confidence, which relates to the point of an Afrocentric culture and a validating system for sure. I get that. That's one. But then I think there's also the second trajectory, which is much more the skills to lead and thrive and shape. Because I think we don't do both of those tracks on this continent, on this country, we'll struggle. So we need both of those things. So this is a differentiated strategy. Now, I guess my short answer, without it would take a real conversation to understand, like to hear what the ideas are for what the alternative is. And so I think we've got, I think to the point of perfection and good, we've got a lot of work to do to get kids learning, reading, understanding, building agency. And absolutely, I think we need to shift build much more representation in the leadership, in the who is leading and deciding and shaping our schools. I think that will lead cultural shifts that validate kids. So when you come to school, you say, yes, my identity, my voice, my family, my community is validated. I think there are shifts in terms of the transformation of learning, but in terms of reorganizing how schooling works, I'd be curious to the ideas, but I'd be cautious of major sort of, break it all down, because I think there's significant work and needs to we need to take many steps forward, and we really hesitant to take significant steps back before we take steps forward. My perspective, but there's a lot more to that question that I'd be very happy to have sort of a sidebar to really understand it before I really respond to it. Li-Kai, Asyia, maybe for more importantly, keen to hear your reflections on the other questions or on this, if you're keen on.
Yeah, I'm going to dare to say something on the question that you just said. I want to give a quote here. I'm a big fan of assessment-informed instruction. I think it goes across the system from the school all the way up to the national systems. The quote was, the teacher must adapt their teaching to the pupil's capacity and capability. Now, if I was going to do a little poll and say who made that quote or what year it was made by Ghazali 1,000 years. So I'm interested in what would be different when you have when you're doing it based on your own local culture, and are the principles of effective teaching and learning different? Is how you do it definitely is, but are the principles different? On this question about adding arts into the universal standards, I think the fundamentals of having literacy and numeracy can be taught very, very creatively and should be taught creatively, like teaching geometry through art, teaching data handling through looking at where inequity is, and teaching literature, various forms of literature or form through dance. So I think we can be more creative within that, but we've got to get the basics of saying, are our children getting past grade 2, grade 3, being able to read and write so that they can utilize the many opportunities that are available to them. I don't think it should be an either and all.
Li-Kai, I wonder, just in the time we have, I wonder actually if on this we sort of pivot maybe now more towards what you see as the opportunities or the opportunities in ed. The fellowship is a fellowship of early career and aspiring teachers and educators and folks who are on paths to, whether it be master teachers or ultimately school leaders or social entrepreneurs or policymakers, folks early in the career thinking about, I want to make learning better to create more opportunity for children in our country and across the continent and the world. And I wonder, it'd be really interesting just from where the work you've done, what is exciting to you? What do you see as the opportunities or the imperatives looking ahead in school system improvements?
That's a fantastic question, Chinezi. So maybe I can offer two thoughts here. It's a food for thought. So, and this also, I think, links to the question earlier around how do we develop a more unique education system for South Africa? Maybe the two are linked. So, since 2010, there is in 2017, we also developed another report. And this is building on the 2010 effort. This one is where we work together with OECD to go a bit deeper, right, in terms of identifying beyond just school system improvement intervention, what are the real drivers of student learning, student outcomes? And this is where we applied some advanced analytics to look at the PISA data across our school system, see what actually drives student learning. But let me fast forward. So here's the provocation, which is one of the key findings we found was student mindsets. And this, I think, would probably could be food for thought, or potentially even a call to action for young educational leaders such as we have here. So the premise here was based on the research, based on the PISA research and everything. What we found was student mindsets have 3 times the impact on student learning outcomes compared to socioeconomic backgrounds in Middle East and North Africa. In other parts of the world, twice, but it's a huge impact. So let me unpack that. What that means is when we looked at all the drivers of student learning, student outcomes, mindsets, home environment, student behavior, school factors, everything else, mindsets have 3 times the predictive impact on student outcomes compared to home environment. So we all know as in the education sector that it takes decades to change the socioeconomic outcome or background of a child. And we also know that socioeconomic factors are the single biggest predictors of learning outcomes. But what the research is showing is students with better calibrated mindsets can leapfrog compared to students with better home environment, better socioeconomic outcomes. And we also found the 2 most powerful mindsets. One is growth mindsets, which is the concept of if I work harder, I'll do better. If I put in more effort, I have better outcomes. And also motivation calibration. Not motivation in terms of I want to be better. Motivation calibration is does a child or student understand what behaviors will result in, what behaviors are indicative of motivation? So I finish what I start. I don't delay, I don't procrastinate. So these 2 mindsets we found were the most predictive of learning outcomes out of all the mindsets that we looked at. So what does that mean? This means as we embark on learning on education reform, or as embark on our professional journeys as educational leaders and so on, how do we embed this concept? How do we embed the concept of mindset improvement? How do we embed it in terms of the curriculum, the teaching and learning, the practices, even how we incentivize schools, teachers, even how we engage with our students, so that mindset improvement embedded in everything we do? Can that be a way to leapfrog? Right? Because as Chinezi pointed out in research, a school system can move out one performance band from poor, very good, great every 6 years. For a school system to move from poor to great to excellent, that's 24 years, which is way too long, and that's unacceptable. Can we use this concept of mindset improvement to allow us to leapfrog? Because socioeconomic improvement takes time. Can we use this mindset change to leapfrog? So with that, I think that's first provocation. The second provocation may be relevant for South Africa, and again, I'm not familiar with the system, unlike Chinezi and everyone in the room is. A much wiser system leader once, a few years ago, once told me this rallying cry, which I think actually quite relevant to South Africa, which is, whilst we don't expect every school, every system to be a certain level, but one thing we cannot compromise on is improvement. So we came out with the concept of the 7 everys. The push is every province, every district, every school, every principal, every class, every teacher, every student needs to improve every year. Actually, that's 8 every, sorry, 8. And we don't care what your starting point is. And we are not expecting everybody to reach the same level. But we expect the 8 everys to happen. Sorry, Chinezi, I've been rambling.
The silence is letting it settle, because those are 2 fantastic provocations. I would love to, I will follow up offline on some of the research around mindset, because if I think about the work we do with schools, I think it's tremendously powerful, particularly in a time such as COVID. If you think about it, the mindset it takes to actually persevere and work and succeed through that. So really, thank you for that, Li-Kai. Asyia, I would love to close with before we hand it back to Sihle to sort of lead the overall conference forward, summit forward, close with what you see that gives you a sense of opportunity in education at the moment.
So I agree with the mindset. I think the mindset also links to the expectation. How do we raise the expectation of every person in the system? I really like that. And for me, I think three things. There's the shift. I'm excited about shifting the dialogue so that in the global education space, from access to learning. And that means a shift in vocabulary as well, that we are talking about things that are rooted in pedagogic are about how do we improve the quality of teaching and how do we improve the quality of teaching for at scale and in a sustainable way. A couple of reports that are coming out is RTI will be doing a learning at scales report, which looked at 8 systems that shifted learning outcomes. And then there's this aspect of local solutions, and it links to a little bit earlier that point out having a northern imposed system, but actually the solutions are going to come from local settings, from national settings. So how do we support researchers, implementers, and school improvement professionals more to be working at ecosystem level? And then thirdly, I noticed a comment that united this one, is innovation for the underserved. I actually believe that we need, and innovation doesn't have to be, technology or really complicated, but how do we improve learning outcomes for those who are most underserved in geographies, perhaps based on gender, but definitely based on income. And so pedagogical research and development and technological research and development that always go to how do we improve the quality of teaching and hence the quality of learning.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you, Asyia, for sharing your holiday with us, Li-Kai, for sharing your Friday late evening with us. Really appreciate you both. What a privilege and pleasure to be able to hear your reflections on this topic. Thanks again from all of us at Jakes Gerwel Fellowship. Sihle, let me turn over to you. We're slightly over time, so we'll close here. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, Chinezi. Thank you, Asyia. Thank you, Li-Kai, for making the time. This has certainly been a very enriching conversation. I look forward to chatting even more about this. I'm quite excited and inspired at what we've discussed here today. So thank you very much. Shukran. Xie asante sana. I hope that we'll be able to have more of these conversations on a regular basis, hopefully. So I just want to let the audience know that we will have the videos uploaded into YouTube. So if you do want to kind of go back and have a look at what's gone on in this conversation, you'll certainly have access to that on our YouTube channel, or if you want to share that with anyone else. Thank you very much for joining us today. I will now hand over to Jeremy to send out a message.
Thank you, Sihle. Li-Kai, I see you still there. Chinezi, Asyia, if you're on the call, just adding my thanks. To the public that have been watching, thank you for joining us. Please join us again later on for the Technology Roundtable. We're looking forward to that. We're going to shift internally with our students to take a few moments just to reflect on what's been said. And I have some information to share with you about our 1 o'clock session. So students, please don't go anywhere. We're going to take another 5 minutes quickly. I've asked the tech team that are supporting us to very quickly, randomly, put us into some breakaway groups, because I don't know about you, but I've just been blown away by what we've listened to in the last 2 hours. I don't know if you can appreciate how valuable it is to hear the CEOs of prominent organizations speak, to have access to world leaders literally sitting around the world to reflect on their work. And, for us as a JGF community to be able to sit and listen and learn from them, I'm stunned by that. I want us to take just a couple of minutes to pause and reflect on what we've heard and what it's meant for us. And we're going to do that in a small group, so there's a little bit of accountability. So in a moment, you're going to be offered the opportunity to quickly go jump into a small group with 2 or 3 other people. And it's only going to be for 5 minutes, and then the group will close. So Keegan or James, if you're able to do that for us, please go ahead. I want you simply in those small groups to reflect, what is the one thing that has stood out for you so far this morning? Just one thing. I'm sure there are many, but keep it to one. Each person in that small group have a chance. We'll then bring you back into the session in a 5 minutes time. So Keegan or James, if you're able to put us into those groups, that'll be wonderful. See us up into the group as soon as you're given that opportunity. Thanks.